All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Look, we need to talk about that one weakness you've been carrying around for years. You know exactly the one I mean, right? That stubborn pattern you keep promising yourself you'll finally fix. Maybe you made a resolution last January and the January before that, and suddenly you have a treadmill that functions exclusively as a really expensive laundry rack. You've essentially made peace with this small surrender, kind of just dismissing it as harmless. You tell yourself that compared to real, massive problems, this little indulgence doesn't look like much at all.
We love to tell ourselves it's just a harmless habit, right? Something that is totally under our control. We think, oh, I could totally stop if I really wanted to. But the reality mapped out in the source material is much more structural and, honestly, a little bit intimidating. We use the word habit to soften the blow, to make our actions seem like a loose piece of clothing we can just take off whenever we feel like it. But that is a dangerous miscalculation. So, why do you keep losing the exact same battle over and over? Well, it's because while you were ignoring those tiny surrenders, while you were writing them off as just this once, your brain was actually actively editing its own physical architecture. Every single time you give in, there is something deeply physical happening inside your skull. The structure of your brain that you'll wake up with tomorrow is actively being written tonight by what you're doing right now.
So that brings us to part 1, the myth of weakness, moving from a character flaw to a neural circuit.
First off, we've got to completely reframe how we look at our personal struggles. Toss the moral judgments out the window. Stop calling it a weakness. That word sounds like this permanent, heavy verdict about your character, right? Something woven into your soul that you just have to battle forever. But as long as you frame it like that, you are fighting the completely wrong enemy. The brilliant neuroscientist Carla Schatz nailed this in just 6 words. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Every single time you give in to that pattern, a very specific group of neurons fires in a specific sequence. And because they fire together, they wire together just a tiny bit tighter. You are physically thickening a circuit through use.
Just look at the stark contrast here. If you view weakness as a character flaw, well, there's really nothing to do except kind of hate yourself for having it. It feels permanent. But if your weakness is just a neural circuit, literally just a physical pathway etched by repetition, well, then something absolutely incredible becomes possible. It can be unbuilt, and not through shame or empty promises, but using the exact same mechanism that built it.
Let's take a quick walk through time to see how this idea actually builds. Way back in 1889, Freud actually intuited this physical connection. Fast forward to 1949, and psychologist Donald Hebb formally described how neurons form actual physical connections. But the whole shebang culminates in the modern era with psychiatrist Norman Doidge. His incredible research on neuroplasticity proved the brain is just this continuously remodeling structure. I mean, he documented stroke victims reclaiming speech that the medical field had declared permanently lost, purely by forcing the brain to restructure its circuits through repetition. It is an absolutely miraculous finding.
All right, moving to part 2, neurons that fire together, the silent construction. Understanding that repetition actually rewires the brain forces this merciless shift in perspective. You are not a fixed character. You are a pattern being physically built every single day. And the most disturbing detail in Doidge's research? It isn't just that a weakness gets stronger, it's how completely silent it is. There's no alarm bell going off when you solidify a bad circuit. So in the heat of the moment when you have to make a decision, you are not choosing between 2 equal options. Your conscious intention, your willpower, is incredibly expensive and it's slow. It's literally like stumbling down a footpath in the dark. Meanwhile, your established neural circuit, it's this hyper-efficient, unconscious, freshly paved highway. By the time your slow willpower even shows up to the fight, that highway circuit has already fired. You aren't weak, you're just outmatched by your own architecture.
Which leads us to part 3, the plastic paradox, the danger of neuroplasticity.
Now, this paradox is what Norman Doidge called the absolute most dangerous discovery in his entire field. It's a concept that quietly, completely undoes all those comforting stories we have about sudden, magical change. The plastic paradox is basically the biological reality that the exact same machinery inside your skull that could rebuild you from the ground up is the exact same machinery currently cementing the very pattern you wish you didn't have. There aren't 2 different brain systems, one for good habits and one for bad. No, there's only one system, and it faithfully builds whatever you feed it. Your capacity for transformation and your capacity for rigidity are literally the exact same thing. Basically, your brain is morally blind. It operates strictly on a use it or lose it basis. The same mechanism that lets a concert pianist play flawlessly without conscious thought is the exact machinery letting your weakness trigger without thought. It literally does not distinguish between a skill that elevates you and a behavior that hollows you out. It strengthens both, using the exact identical mechanism. And this is exactly why fighting your circuits with shame or self-hatred is just a completely useless weapon. Neurons do not feel guilt, they only feel use.
Let's look at part 4, the 1% principle, how to actually rewire.
Okay, so how do we actually fight back? Well, the real work of changing isn't about generating this massive surge of willpower for some heroic 90-day life overhaul. In fact, the brain doesn't even respond to heroic intensity. It rewires through the boring, consistent, repeated firings of this 1% principle. You have to find the absolute smallest possible behavior that contradicts your weakness. I'm not talking about the impressive version you'd brag about to your friends, but an action so minor it almost feels insulting to even count it. That tiny 1% is the actual unit of neurological rewiring.
Let's actually break this down into actionable steps. Step 1, choose that tiny, contradicting action. Seriously, even if it's just putting on your running shoes without actually going for a run. Step 2, execute it daily in roughly the exact same place and time. Context is massive here. By tying a tiny action to a stable environment, you teach your nervous system exactly where and when to expect this new behavior. And step 3, repeat it, even when it feels totally flat. Practicing this 1% won't give you a rush or any kind of emotional payoff right away. The change is invisible in real time, so you really just have to trust the silent process.
But here is the brutal half of the story that most people just completely skip over. Brain real estate is limited. These circuits are actively competing for territory inside your skull. Neuroplasticity isn't just constructive, it is highly competitive. When one circuit is heavily used, it expands. When another is used less, it contracts and basically gives up its territory.
We already know neurons that fire together wire together. But the absolutely vital counterpart to that is that neurons that fire apart wire apart. You can practice your new 1% habit perfectly with the discipline of a monk, but if you keep indulging the old weakness just this once, you are actively maintaining its dominance. You are keeping its territory occupied.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, Voting for Your Future, the Power of Disuse.
Because the brain is so competitive, we have to radically change how we view those small, quote-unquote, harmless indulgences we constantly grant ourselves. Here's the reality check. There is no such thing as a neutral surrender. The brain just doesn't have a setting for this time doesn't count. Every single slip occupies neural territory. You don't just need to build a new pattern, you must actively starve the old one. People so often try to practice a new circuit while continuing to reinforce the old comfort, and then they wonder why nothing ever changes. It's because disuse isn't just a passive state. Disuse is a weapon. What you stop using weakens, and what you keep using wins.
Every single repetition is a vote. The brain doesn't reward your grand plans for the future. It strictly ratifies your repeated patterns. It tallies every single repetition as a ballot for the person you are going to become in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. It doesn't care which circuit wins the election. It just faithfully enforces the final result. So I'll leave you with this final question to think about. What are you voting for today? Because there is a version of you arriving in 2 years. You don't get to choose if that future version of you shows up. You only get to vote on who that person is. And you are voting right now in the actual sequence of small, almost invisible choices you are about to make in the next 12 hours. The weakness doesn't break in one dramatic moment, it starves. And the self you want to be doesn't just arrive, it accumulates. So, what exactly is your next behavior electing?